So to introduce ourselves, my name is Orly. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a climate justice and gender equity activist, and I'm just so excited to talk about the intersection of the climate crisis and women's rights.
Hi everyone, my name is Linka. I also use she, her pronouns, and I'm the co-president of the Girl Up Greater Boston Coalition, and I've also done climate organizing in my state. So I'm super excited for this workshop and just to be here with all of you today.
Yeah, so there are multiple kinds of intersectional forms of oppression. But when it comes to the climate crisis and women's rights, we've narrowed it down to three main intersectional issues, and those are a lack of access to resources and to rights, also a lack of access to education, and also environmental racism. We're going to dive into each of these three topics in more detail during the presentation.
So the first one is the lack of rights and resources. And as we talked about before, this really manifests when it comes to gender inequality and how that's exacerbated by the climate crisis. And I think when I first began climate organizing, I learned about the climate in a very sort of detached way. Like I learned about global warming and being far away in the Arctic and something that wouldn't affect me at all, but oh, good to know scientifically speaking. And I feel like that set me up to think of it as something that doesn't really affect people. And I didn't see the issue's humanity. So as I started to, join the climate movement and learn more and educate myself about this issue, I started to realize that it's really the people who are at the center of this issue, along with all the species that are going extinct, because ultimately the climate crisis is yet another overlapping oppression and overlapping crisis that can really exacerbate inequality. So today we're just going to dive into the humanity of the issue, which I hope will be an angle that you'll learn from.
Totally. So to start off, environmental disasters really destroy communities. And in places where women lack access to rights and resources, they're actually likely to be even more dependent on men after an environmental disaster. For example, there are places where women aren't allowed to go to school. And we saw that in that Kahoot, that 130 million girls and women around the world don't have access to an education. So if men have more access to money because of their education, and a family has lost their home due to an environmental disaster, women might become dependent on the men in their lives for housing and food, even if these relationships are toxic or abusive.
There are several ways in which the climate crisis really disproportionately impacts women. And as Orly said, women's economic independence in general, even without the climate crisis, is lower than men's. But the climate crisis heaps on another aspect of this inequality. So an example would be women in agriculture. Currently, women represent around 43% of the global agricultural workforce, but they face a lot of barriers to economic independence. In fact, women are often denied property rights in half of the countries around the world. They're often barred from borrowing money, so they can't use that for things that can get their crops to be successfully reaching harvest, like fertilizer. And ultimately, they have trouble even accessing markets to sell their harvest because of this lack of economic independence, and sometimes even a lack of infrastructure. So as the climate crisis occurs and soil quality worsens and water becomes more scarce, it's really women who will have a hard time coping with all of this because they'll be less able to find the financing they need to become resilient to this changing conditions. And if they can't buy property, they will be stuck without any ability to even continue their agricultural careers. So that's just one way in which climate change is impacting a lot of women worldwide. And it also impacts their physical safety because, as Orly said, women are often forced to stay in toxic or abusive relationships as the climate crisis occurs because their partners will have things like money that they desperately need to live. And they can also be targeted due to their displacement. An example of this is in Nigeria, where the terrorist group Boko Haram has targeted populations that are particularly made up of women who have been displaced from their land because of drought. So as you can see, the climate crisis and gender inequality really mutually reinforce each other.
Totally. To elaborate, in some places, women and girls are responsible for walking to a water source to collect water. And in Africa, 90% of Lake Chad, which is a really big water source, has evaporated because of global warming. And this has forced women and girls to walk longer distances to access their water. And also, walking all day to fetch water prevents women and girls from going to school. So while women gather water, men are able to generate income. And then in the case of an environmental disaster, like the drought they're experiencing, women become dependent on the men in their lives who have more access to money and other resources.
And then one more way in which these lack of rights and resources can impact people is when it comes to climate refugees. And actually, this is kind of a symptom of a larger problem because the United Nations official definition of a refugee has not been updated. So it doesn't include people who are displaced by climate disasters, and that's happening more and more often. So an example of a way in which this might affect people is in Bangladesh. It's an incredibly vulnerable nation when it comes to climate change, given its location, but that's also where many Rohingya Muslims have fled. So, under the international definition of a refugee, the Rohingya people are not considered refugees because they're stateless. So, they're not legally considered refugees, so they won't be allowed to enter most countries. And Bangladesh has opened its borders to them, but now, even so, these people are more likely to be displaced once again because of the climate crisis that is impacting Bangladesh. So it's just waves of refugees and overlapping problems. And they still won't fit the definition of a refugee. And the women of Bangladesh are really among the first to face the impacts of climate change. For example, in a cyclone in 1991, 90% of the people who died in that cyclone were women. So I hope this has given a bit of a background on really how these issues work together.
Yeah, our next topic is education, which is essential to creating a foundation to someone's values and decision making. And yet 130 million girls around the world lack access to an education. So let's talk about how this affects their likelihood to survive an environmental disaster. This is such a good quote from the Malala Fund. It says, if every girl were able to exercise her sexual and reproductive health and rights through quality education and had access to modern contraception, it could reduce total emissions from fossil fuels by 37 to 41% by the end of the century.
In 2021, climate-related events will prevent 4 million girls from completing their education. So that's on top of the 130 million girls already out of school. And as Jana Amin mentioned, the 30 million more girls who won't be able to go back due to COVID. So the climate crisis really is directly impacting girls' access to education. And by 2025, it will also prevent 12.5 million girls from completing their education every year. However, educating girls is the solution. And as we'll see on the next slide, and as Orly touched on before, educating girls has the potential to actually solve the climate crisis.
Totally.
So if we were to provide girls with education and reproductive health care, it would actually reduce carbon emissions by 85.4 gigatons, which would make it a more effective solution than solar power by 4 times. So when we talk about the climate crisis as if it's just about renewable energy, that's just one aspect. Educating girls and uplifting women can actually be part of the solution. And we've also seen that when women are at the helm of countries, those nations are more likely to take environmental protection efforts seriously. And as we can see here, Jacinda Ardern, who is the Prime Minister of New Zealand, has really been a leader in the global climate movement when it comes to global leaders. So really, women and girls are the solution, and that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, an example of when uneducated women were affected by an environmental disaster was in 2004, when a tsunami hit Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and India. And an Oxfam report says that the ratio between surviving men to surviving women was about 3 to 1, because women weren't taught how to swim. They were taught to look out for their children and their other relatives. So when the tsunami hit, men had the chance to save themselves. They knew how to swim, while women were looking out for their families and often struggling to save them.
Another angle of this that we want to introduce is environmental racism, because as Alisea mentioned in her intersectionality talk, they mentioned that feminism and climate change are issues that especially impact women of color. So we're going to show a quick video that will kind of delve into environmental racism and how it impacts. I think it's definitely fascinating to learn about how, you know, like like I said, we may consider this issue as being something abstract, but it's something that's impacting communities every day.
Definitely. All right, to continue. Oh, all right. Do you see my slides?
Yep, all good.
Awesome. All right, like you can go ahead.
Sounds good. So as I kind of mentioned, Hurricane Katrina is an example of interlocking racism, the climate crisis, and gender inequality. So I think we can move on to a visual interpretation of this.
Totally. So to summarize, the three main intersectional issues that we brought up today were a lack of access to rights and resources, a lack of education, and environmental racism.
So what can you do about this? Even though young women around the world have been hit hardest by climate change, they're also at the helm of climate action. Women have been leaders in the climate movement since scientists first realized that carbon dioxide was warming the atmosphere. And that was first discovered actually by a woman more than 150 years ago in 1856. American scientist Eunice Newton found that there was a connection between these two things. And now we're still seeing women at the helm of the climate movement, like Greta Thunberg, who began the youth-led Fridays for Future movement, which both Orly and I were a part of, and which has had more than 9.6 million strikers around the world in over 250 countries. There's also Vanessa Nakate from Uganda, who has also been leading the Fridays for Future movement there. And I think one of the quotes of hers that sticks out to me is that in her country, a lack of rain means starvation and death for the less privileged. And she's been really bringing to the forefront the crises that are happening in African nations when it comes to climate change. And last but not least, one of the many incredible activists is Autumn Peltier from Canada, and she's a member of the First Nations there. And she's also mentioned that we can't eat money or drink oil. And that's something that has resonated with me a lot, because I think that also brings forth the fact that we really need to be fighting for our resources, and what seems to be being the obstacle between taking climate action or not, is something really that is disconnected from the humanity of this issue.
Yeah. So another thing that you can do to take action is keep track of legislation and make your voice heard in local government. Make sure to hold your officials accountable. For example, in the picture on the right, I was talking to my state representative about equitable climate legislation, and you can do it too. Also, you should use your passions and skills to raise awareness. Art has been a crucial part of this movement. So if you like writing, you can use op-eds and poetry and persuasive essays, really anything. And through art and writing, not only can we raise awareness, but we can also create realities in which our frustrations don't exist. You can write a poem about a world where gender norms don't exist, or use painting to create a reality where white supremacy isn't a thing. So I highly encourage you to get in touch with your creative side and use it in your advocacy.
We also hope that you consider joining Girl Up if you haven't, because organizations like this help to educate and empower others to take action, and we'll keep mobilizing for these issues and for these intersectional types of organizing. And I really hope that you'll consider joining the Boston Coalition if you're in the area, or even just Girl Up globally, which brings us together as a community to drive this change. And last but not least, we hope that you'll actively learn from others in the climate justice movement, because different perspectives are important. And as we saw, the people who are hit hardest by climate change are women, people of color, people in developing countries, youth. So just getting to learn from all these people who may not look like you, but who also share experiencing the climate crisis is incredibly important, and I hope you'll do that. So we're really glad you were able to join us today, and we hope you learned from this workshop. And you can find us on Instagram and email us if you have any questions at all.
Thank you.